Cool, cool. I have been pretty solid. How are you?
Nice. I'm good.
Nice. Yeah, I appreciate you doing this. Good to
Mm-hmm.
be getting my podcast fired up again. It's been a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, it actually worked out well because I was like, you know, I learned like a little bit about World War II, but I also feel like I don't remember anything from it. And so it kind of works out because I would like to learn
Mm-hmm.
more. So I'm just gonna hit you with a bunch of questions, I suppose. Um,
Great.
I mean, I guess the first one was like, why World War II versus other wars? Like, what about that attracted you to it?
Versus other wars, it seemed, initially when I was young, it was like, there's all these movies about it. It was so publicized. You had the History Channel basically dedicated to it at that time. And so there was all this input and all this like very dramatization of it. And part of that was the just propaganda being upgraded, being transformed through the years, you know, because in the 30s, 40s, 50s, it was, you know, the most devastating, greatest war. It was the biggest event, and it was at that time. It was a massive ordeal. It greatly affected the lives we live today. It's, you know, losing relevance a little bit, but with all of the stuff that's currently going on in modern affairs in America, Russia, Europe, Brexit, like all of these things can be traced back to World War II, World War One, these two wars.
Hmm. How does it trace back?
It's ideas, it's concepts, things that were developed during World War II. Before World War II, we had laissez-faire. Then World War II was the introduction of the government in economics, in the personal sphere more after they had been completely removed in the 1700s. And so you have what was the beginning ideas of social democracy, which would become the premier form of government in Europe. Spain, France, Germany, Britain to an extent, Norway, Sweden, Finland, they all exercise this form of democracy.
Hmm. How does that play out? Is that just because like the production, the government got more involved in like factories and production? Like, how did it actually
Mhm.
translate?
So, what happened before this new idea so before you had laissez-faire, then you had the idea of
No, can I pause you? What's the
yep,
laissez-faire? I don't know what that is.
laissez-faire is the idea in simplicity, the market can run itself. The market
Okay.
will do what the market does.
Okay. Okay.
And it'll write itself. It'll be fine on its own.
So, so is that would that parallel more of like you could call it almost like a libertarian
Mhm.
concept? Okay,
Yep.
cool.
This was only kind of true. It kind of worked, and mostly only for the rich. That's why you had oil barons, you know, these like not just oil barons, but captains of industry, people that were uber rich and were able to suppress the poor, in the 1800s, early 1900s. Think of coal mines. It was, slavery. Like these major institutions were allowed to persist without government interdiction. And so the government never actually got involved in this American case until things were really bad. And slavery is a little bit of a different example because they knew from the beginning that was not going to be allowed to persist. But things like child labor laws, women's suffrage, these ideas kind of relate back to that hands-off approach from the government, where the
Okay.
government didn't want to get involved until it was necessary.
And when they did get involved, like how did that end up looking? Like, how did they? I guess, sink their fingers into it? And why did they do it too, I guess, would be a better question.
So let's put this back into relating to the marketplace, right? So you have free market. And if you look at all of the crashes, the economic crashes that occur between 1850 and 1930, they are every 5, 10 years. Very common. They are bad too, consistently very bad. Imagine if you had a 2008 every 5 years.
Yeah,
Bad.
bad.
And so the poor were poor, poor, and they could not get out. And that's the case in the West in general, France, Britain, the US especially. And what happened right after World War II and a little bit during World War II is they started to think, okay, well, we were able to mobilize this massive industry just with the government. The government was really effective in doing so. And so they think, okay, well, if we just allow the government to have more hand in the market, well, that coupled with the complete Western ownership of the entire Western market, everything becoming way more interconnected. The US has industries after World War II, and every single Western country, Japan, China, we're invested everywhere. And so what then happens is major economic growth. The largest amount of economic growth, consistent economic growth that has ever been seen since the times before laissez-faire.
Hmm.
So
So
it's sorry.
when the government like did
Mm.
intervene during World War II, like did it work well? Like did they like do a good job? Like it was beneficial all around?
During World War II, it was mostly about mobilizing arms. And as it turns out, the government was really good at mobilizing arms industry.
Hmm.
And so when they were tasked with this objective of, okay, we have this many countries, this many people, and we need this many guns, they're good at that. Or at least they were. I mean, we haven't really had a conflict like that in 80 years.
Yeah. Hmm.
And so they were good at it, especially America, since we were the most industrially developed. We were able to en masse mobilize the most industry.
You have any theories on like why they seem to do so well in that regard? And then seemingly they don't, one, I don't even know if they do that well now. Maybe they do, I don't know. But like it seems like they're wildly inefficient in most other areas. Like, do you have any theories on like why it seemed to work well there and it just doesn't seem to apply in the same way now?
I think part of it is we have a really well doctrined military. And so military over expenditure is not really a problem. Usually, military over expenditure is going into actual development projects. And so when you're dumping that much money into the military, there's going to be waste. There's going to be waste in everything, you know?
Yeah.
I think they were so good at it then because they were coming off of laissez-faire, because they were dipping their hand into the pie. Nowadays, they're wanting more and more of that pie, it seems.
Hmm. So it was kind of like the infrastructure, the foundation was laid really well, so that then there was just the groundwork was laid for things to like kind of flow. But then since then, as they've like kind of almost like eroded the original foundation, now all of a sudden stuff is like breaking apart a little bit
Hmm.
more. Okay. And I when I think about it too with like World War II, Why exactly did it start?
To go into that, you kind of have to go into World War One,
We can do that.
where it started. Um, Brief rundown on World War One. Um, Austria-Hungary, which is a major Balkan empire, but it's also very divided because of all the very different nationalist culture groups. You know, you had the Serbs were especially one. They had recently broken free from the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and Austria-Hungary wanted them back. And so you had this partially occupied Serbia, you had Czechoslovakia, you had, Bosnia Herzegovina, you had Croatia, Slovenia, all of these different countries under Austrian throne. And obviously, if you were an American, you wouldn't want to be under the British crown, right? Imagine if the British came back and just took over the country. And obviously, you can think of how angry people would be. Same idea. And so you have that, and then you have the Serbian, who is our Serbian nationalist group. One of those Serbians ends up killing an archduke who was the heir to the Austrian throne, which means there's no heir to the Austrian throne. And Austria-Hungary is now demanding that Serbia basically gives up their country or gets invaded. Serbia, who is allied with Russia, Russia, who is allied with Paris and France, or Paris, France and Britain, my bad. And so Austria-Hungary, who's allied with the Ottoman Turks and Germany, and now you have a very large global war about to kick off.
Hmm. Do you
And
think there was like something that could have been done to like reasonably avoid it?
to reasonably avoid it, I think it's kind of difficult
Yeah.
because to avoid World War One, it's not to dodge World War One, you would have to have a dissolution of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire.
Mm.
The Balkans are known as the powder keg of Europe for a reason. They were, because of these new ideas of nationalism that were starting to emerge, these different culture groups wanted their own country. More and more, they were becoming more extreme, and it was only going to build up as they were oppressed. It was
Mm.
only
Okay.
going to get worse. And so I think the only way that World War One could have been avoided is if Austria-Hungary had not gone down the route of war, had maybe just like backed off. But after losing, like that's like if we only had one possible president for the next 50 years, only one candidate that we could possibly have, and he was just killed. And now we have no idea who else to put in charge. It's a bad place to be when your current ruler is like 70.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So not very avoidable.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So then like going forward a little bit, how does it all end up playing out?
Germany absolutely destroys Russia with like not even a developed like military front. Like Germany is putting 80% of their resources on France and 20% on Russia, and Russia just falls apart. This is what would lead to Lenin taking control in the October Revolution. And so you have Russia turning into a slowly devolving into a communist hellhole because it's just constant war and there's coups and there's so many different factions and factionalism. So they piece out of the war. That's why you have the Soviet Union in World War II. under Stalin. In the West, things are not as good. Germany, in their like early blitzkrieg kind of tactics that haven't fully been developed yet, are able to push almost to Paris before reaching a complete stalemate, and they would stay there until 1916 for 2 years, basically, when for those 2 years, people had been digging underneath their no man's land to their trench, where they placed thousands of pounds of explosive. And it was the, up to that point, largest single explosion in war.
Hmm. Huh.
And it completely decimated like tens of thousands of people, completely destroyed their trench. They had been placing and building and trenching for 2 years. So then they fall back to essentially like just west of Alsace. And from there, they just sit until eventually Germany breaks. They don't have the industrial capacity, they don't have the economic capacity, they don't have the ability for a long-term maintained war. And they knew that from the beginning, and they were hoping they could take out France, hold off Russia, force a peace treaty, but it just never occurred.
Hmm. What would have happened if they could have done that?
If they could have done it, it would have been very different. They probably wouldn't have taken over all of France like we see in World War II. They probably would have just taken over the lowland countries, taken over Denmark entirely. They probably would have had a good chunk of northeastern France and left it at that.
Hmm.
France would be beaten. They would be, I mean, France would have probably fallen into a communist revolution. After World War One, they were really, really suffering from communist extremism. And so it was partly why their they never had a great military after World War One. I mean, it wasn't bad. It wasn't as bad as people make it out to be, you know, in like the France white flag, you know,
Yeah.
but they did not put any considerable military funding into that because they focus on the civilian sector to keep people from starting a legitimate revolution.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That was just military was the last priority.
Hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So like all of that kind of comes about. Like what happens next?
Then you have the interwar period, kind of after World War One. Austria-Hungary is completely taken apart. They lose virtually their entire country. Austria itself, the German Austrians, have their own country still. They didn't lose any of their land, but every single country in Austria-Hungary is now their own state. So you have Serbia, Yugoslavia, which took control over all of the Balkans essentially, and then you have Hungary as its own country, and Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece are given up by the Ottoman Turks. Ottomans no longer exist. It's now Turkey under Ataturk. Ataturk would die pretty much in the lead up to World War II, which would make a very large power vacuum, which would make them not join World War II.
Hmm. Okay.
And you have Saudi Arabia as its own country, Egypt as a British colony still. You have Iraq now in control by Britain. Basically, you have the Middle East carved up by Britain and France with the dissolution of the Ottomans.
Okay. Okay.
So, in this interwar period, France is not having a great time. Communism is on the rise. Leninism is in full grasp in
Yes, later to
USSR.
turn the TV down just a touch.
Hmm?
Thank you. What is Leninism?
It's kind of hard to describe. It's basically just a cult of personality. It's like we follow Marxism under a different name.
Okay.
It's different from Stalinism and Trotskyism, which are actually different. Leninism was more or less just collectivization, putting together a single unified communist state and then building it forth. Um, Trotskyism, which was the direct rival to Stalin, he wanted to really expand communism to other countries and not have a direct control over them, but just to have communism in place. Stalin wanted to focus on his individual country and then expand that country by taking over other countries. He wanted to subjugate versus expand.
Mm, okay. Okay. Trying to think. Um, so Leninism comes up.
Mhm.
What's, I guess, how things like move forward from there?
Lenin basically, not he himself, obviously, but him and his party are able to solidify Bolshevik control. Excuse me. So the White Party slash the Cossacks out east had mobilized with what was left of the Tsar's control and attempted to retake over the country from the east. And what followed was a bloody civil war that lasted essentially from 1917 until 1923-24. And it ended with all of them being killed pretty much or sent to Siberia for work camps.
Wow. Okay.
Um, in Britain, you don't really see a lot of change. You do see in 1930 the passing of the London Naval Treaty, which essentially mandates I'm the best naval power and you're not allowed to be one.
Yeah.
And so that was mostly put upon to Germany. France was allowed to keep all of its stuff, wasn't really limited. It was mostly just to keep the Balkan powers, all of the rising new ones, Italy, Germany, the Ottoman Turks, who then became Turkey. The Turkish had actually started to try to build up a new navy and actually contend with the London Naval Treaty, but they never really got there.
Mm,
Um, Germany, this was technically the second London Naval Treaty. The first one was part of the naval war with Britain during World War One. Um, Germany didn't really want to build up a big new navy that would be crazy and like they wanted to focus on submarines, small ships because they were technically not allowed to be building ships because of the Treaty of Versailles.
okay. So was the answer then to build submarines in secret, or is it just that like somehow submarines were okay?
Building them in secret,
Okay.
yeah, they were smaller submersibles. So if someone flew a plane over you, they're not going to see them. You know, it's just a lot easier to hide 10 submarines than it is one,
Yep.
carrier, one, battleship.
Yep. Okay. And so they're amassing like some of their military rebuilding a little bit, like to what end? Do they have like an end goal already in sight, or are they just doing it to do it?
So pre-Hitler, Hitler was put in power in 1933. They were doing it because they could be legitimately invaded by France. Military speaking, they could be taken over by almost any of their neighbors. They
Hmm.
weren't
Okay.
because all of their neighbors were having turmoil. Hungary was a new country trying to figure itself out. It had ties to the Austrian-Hungarian throne, but they were still, finding their footing. Britain was kind of busy in the Middle East. France was busy not falling apart in on itself. Italy was kind of doing nothing a little bit until they put Mussolini in charge in like 1925. So really, Germany didn't have any direct threat, but they had the knowledge that a direct threat could rise and they could do nothing about it.
Okay. So
Their
they're just preparing
military,
worst case scenario, someone goes
Mhm.
after us. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, they have a proud, long standing military doctrine that goes back to Prussia like 300 years ago. They have always prided themselves on their military, you know. Um, I think it was like John Adams, Ben Franklin, one of the founding fathers had said that Prussia is a state um of military. Was it what was the direct quote? It's a state of military before the government or something like that.
Yep.
I'm remembering it right now. My bad.
No, you're good. So there is kind of like preparing. There's no real like reason, and this is pre-Hitler.
Pre-Hitler.
Okay. So, I mean, I'm assuming then things obviously like start to like progress in the direction slowly towards war. Like, what's kind of the build up to that?
So really they weren't thinking about war until like in the government sphere until Hitler came along. Once Hitler was like in solidified control in like 1934, 35, 36. Once he was like solidly the supreme, he wanted to really push for more military growth. And since he had all of these, military generals, new military minds, Heinz Guderian is one who put forth more the idea of, hey, what if we do combined warfare, but instead of horses and people, we do horses and people and planes and tanks. And so you have more of these more modern ideas coming in play.
Yeah. And at like the time, so like when he, maybe before he had like the firm footing in place, is it known like if he had like a vision for what he wanted to do early on at that point, or did that like come at a later point?
He wrote Mein Kampf in, I believe it was the late 1920s, early 1930s, 1930, I want to say, before he was elected chancellor, which it states pretty much all of his goals, his life. It's an autobiography of him by him. So he says he wants to make Lebensraum. He wants to unify the German peoples. He wants to crush Jews and the communists.
Yeah.
He's very anti everyone. The only people he had a vague respect for, funnily enough, are the Americans and the British.
Hmm. Interesting. Why do you think that is?
Um, I don't know. He was a funny guy.
Yeah.
He obviously didn't like them, but he wasn't going on hateful rants about them every week.
Yeah. So he had this like vision already laid out, and it was like as soon as he got into power, he's kind of like moving in that direction, laying the
Hmm.
groundwork for it. He has like kind of starts rebuilding everything. Um, when does like war start to like really like pop up on the horizon?
War is really ruminating in like 1937. Hitler has been in control for a while, and they just did the Anschluss of Austria, which is essentially just taking over Austria. They put in a German puppet after assassinating the previous head of government, and then eventually just like marched their tanks in, marched their people in, and signed a formal Anschluss. Austria does do declare degree to be a part of Germany. So things are moving in the way of war. The Sudetenland is taken from Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland is originally a very important iron and coal area for Germany pre-World War One. And it was taken over by Czechoslovakia as a part of them being a new free country. They started their own tank programs, their own tank models, their own programs and such on their own, which would later become the basis for a lot of German tanks. The early Panzers were actually partially developed based on Czechoslovakian models. So you see, like, Germany kind of moving in, messing with its neighbors, not really listening to the Treaty of Versailles at all. They've already broken it in multiple different accounts with the militarization of the Rhineland, the building up of their tanks, planes, and actual manpower. And they're using everything that they can to manipulate the Treaty of Versailles so that they aren't breaking the rules, even though they clearly did multiple times.
Hmm.
And no
What,
one intervened.
yeah. Do you think that that could have, if someone would have tried to intervene, do you think that just would have kicked it off sooner?
I think if someone had tried to intervene in 1936 with the militarization of the Rhineland, I think we would have had a very different outlook on the Franco-German War versus World War II.
Okay, so it would have potentially shaped up differently. Who could have reasonably intervened at any point?
France was the dominant military factor. They had actual troops stationed in Germany until like 1935. And they only actually came back with public backlash between the Germans and the French. So they decide to leave Germany. Germany remilitarizes the Rhineland. The Rhineland is an important economic, industrial area that was said to have no people, no forts, no planes, nothing. There was not supposed to be any military development there. The German army moves in. And so in this major breaking of the Treaty of Versailles, France could have declared war and would have been just in doing so.
Hmm, that's interesting. Do you
And
think that would have actually made a difference? Like, do you think it would have like legit if France would have done something that it would have like kind of avoided this whole thing?
I don't know. I mean,
Hard to say.
France and Britain would have been on the same team with this one, but it would have been just them. So it would have mostly just been
Yeah.
naval blockade, keeping them pinned down and then starving them out, pushing where they can, but not making any decisive military action.
That would have been rough too. Like that would have sucked a lot.
It probably would have plunged France into a civil war. Like I can say that with pretty firm confidence with how anti-war they were at that time and how building anti-government sentiment was.
Then that also makes you think too. So like even if they did intervene, if then like France breaks out into a civil war, now
Hmm.
France is like getting destroyed.
Hmm.
Arguably, then that leaves tons of space for Germany to still like come up and do the exact same thing, just with like a depleted France.
Hmm. The issue is 3 years less of development.
True.
So their tanks would have been way worse. They would have had way fewer people. Like the development between 1936 to 1939 was huge. Like they went from in 1936 contemporary with Hungary, Austria, these small countries, to being contemporary with France. which was one of the largest militaries at that time.
Hmm.
So for them to go into this, I think they would have been able to hold their own in just sitting, but I don't think they would have been able to push at all. I don't
Yeah.
think they would have had the people, the guns, the development to do it.
Yeah. And then like 3 years in, by then it's like Germany's like a runaway train that like the momentum you can't really
Yeah,
stop.
they've
Yeah.
taken over the Sudanland, which is so many factories, so much production. Taken over Austria, more production, more people, more guns. They've taken over half of Poland, which is just more people, more guns, more everything.
Yeah.
And then, it just continues moving.
What's like the kickoff point where it's like now like this is the moment like war is rolling.
Poland. So Germany went to Poland and said, "We want the free city of Danzig." Now, at that time, Danzig was originally a part of Prussia. It was a part of the German Empire up until World War One. Then it became its own free independent city, administered by the Polish government. So essentially, it is its own city that is a puppet government of Poland. So it's kind of hard to describe that relationship because it doesn't really exist very much today. Um, but it was just a more free governmenting city to do what it's wanted. It's a trade city with a lot of movement back and forth between the different major powers. So Poland wanted to clamp down control and own Danzig outright. They already had administerial control, tax control, all of that stuff over the area. Germany wanted their major city back. It was more or less just an excuse to declare war on Poland. It
Yeah.
was because you have to have a casus belli, and you can either make one up, which is not great for your people or their people or the international community because they don't like you. But Germany did have a somewhat legitimate reason for taking back Danzig. So they send an ultimatum, give us our Danzig back, or we're going to declare war. Poland says, no, nuh-uh. Germany moves in. Britain and France, who are guaranteeing the independency of Poland, declare war on Germany. Um, Italy joins Germany, and Italy does nothing. Germany takes over half of Poland. The Russians take over the other half. And so Russia is just crushed, split down the middle, gone. And then you have 6 months or nothing happens. So war in Europe is declared. Britain and France are in the war, but nothing happens for 6 months when Germany decides to invade Norway, decides to invade the lowland countries, and decides to move through the Ardennes forest, which was thought to be impassable by the French government.
Hmm. Why do they think it was impassable?
It is a very dense, very rough to get through area. It's called the Black Forest in Germany. It's known as the Enchanted Forest because it's so like spooky and huge and dense. It's one of the most dense forests in all of Europe. And
Hmm.
so they were not thinking that any major force could be moved through the area. And that's
They
not to say it wasn't.
underestimated what the Germans could do with a little bit of meth and willpower.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they moved through the Ardennes and did massive flanking maneuver where they encircled all of the mostly British, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourgish forces to the north, and then the predominantly French forces to the south. And it was a slaughter. Hundreds of thousands were taken captive or killed, mostly taken captive. the French thought it was just a repeat of World War One. Not to say that they thought they were going to win, but to say that they were uh, looking at the French government as incompetent, as unable to even defend them. And so, should that have gone on longer if the Germans were not faster in solidifying control? There probably would have been a civil war in France.
Hmm.
Oh, I can't say that for certain, but
Yeah.
I know civil unrest was pretty big, and I know the anti-war was a pretty big sentiment. So you have Dunkirk, which is a
I
blunder.
saw the movie.
hmm
Yeah.
Dunkirk was a huge blunder on the Germans' part because Hitler himself authorized only the Luftwaffe because at
Luftwaffe.
first the Luftwaffe,
Luftwaffe. What's that?
mhm, it's the German Air Force.
Okay.
So you just have the Air Force. The tanks, the people are all just sitting a few miles outside of Dunkirk, not moving because they were told directly not to. And Rommel, who had a major part in actually encircling Dunkirk, wanted to move in bad, and he was completely disallowed from doing so. He had a tendency to breaking orders and whatnot and not listening to command, which was actually more allowed in the German system due to their different ideas of warfare and advancement and all that stuff. But still, he was very not allowed, and so he ended up not moving in, partly because he was waiting on fuel for his tanks that had virtually run out. So, probably due to Heinrich, who was, I believe, the head of the Air Force at that time, they were only allowed to use the Air Force. And of the 9 days, 10 days that they were stuck in Dunkirk, only three of them were flyable. And so you only had 3 days of taking them out, of which took out 25% of them, but you still had most of the British military. Britain
Hmm.
mobilized most of its military to the lowlands.
Okay.
And they got
And
out
like
the
if
most.
there's the timeline of World War II of like start to finish, where is Dunkirk in
Oh,
this timeline?
getting a call from something, dude.
Oh, Leia, could you also like maybe mute the TV? Because I hear a little like brump, brump.
It's coming from the TV or my monitor. I don't know why.
Oh, interesting. It's fine. Just curious.
Weird. I would like it if it stopped.
Hard to say.
Okay. Can you hear me?
I can.
I just muted myself and unmuted and it worked.
Really? Well, cool. Um, where were we? I think on the timeline.
Mhm. Oh yeah, Dunkirk. So Britain is able to their call.
Hard to say.
Jeez. So Dunkirk is a huge German blunder. Most of the British military is able to get out, and that becomes a major problem for them later. Like Normandy would have been a lot worse without that. The North African campaign would have been way, way worse. Like legitimately, the German high command could have probably taken control over, Lebanon, um, Egypt especially, Libya, all those areas. Most importantly is the um I'm trying to think of the river. The canal, the Egyptian canal, the way through
Oh,
the
the
yeah,
Niles?
I'll be right back.
Word.
Yep. I don't think right back.
Way back.
All right, what were we on? Dunkirk?
Um, I know we'd gotten through Dunkirk, the British army got away, which was like a major problem, and I think around that point.
Yep. So if they were able to squeeze that gap, they would have probably taken out 90% of the British military, which would have allowed later on in the war for Rommel to take over Egypt, which would have made trade between Indochina, China, Japan way more difficult for the Allies and way easier for the Germans, Italians, Japanese.
Okay.
Yeah,
So it was a big moment that could have, if it would have gone differently, would that have just like kind of stopped the momentum against Germany?
it wouldn't have stopped the momentum, but it would have made the war a lot worse.
Yeah.
It would have made it more difficult for any Asian to European trade would have been much more difficult. It all would have had to go instead of through Egypt and through the Mediterranean, through South Africa, around Africa to America, Britain, wherever it's going.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and two with like, so all this stuff's happening, like to I guess like what end? Does Hitler just want the entire like Eastern Hemisphere to be his? Like what's I guess the outcome he's trying to get?
It's a little bit hard to say exactly what he wants, but he outlined Lebensraum, he outlined all the people he wants not alive. So it would have been realistically, if Britain had sued for peace at that point, losing Egypt, losing the Middle East, if Germany had, for example, been able to take out all that stuff, been able to solidify their control, they then would have had a little bit, but not much better hand at taking over Russia. Russia was kind of the end game plan for Hitler. They had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1940-ish, 1939. I remember. Signed in 1939 with the dissolution of Poland. And that basically said no war for 10 years. Germany did not listen.
They're like, nah, fam.
Yeah,
We're definitely fighting.
the Russians knew it would end too, but they were busy. And partly why Hitler invaded when he did was because of Finland. Finland was after World War One, part of the treaty that the Russians had signed in 1917. Finland was to become its own state. Finland Finland would end up fighting two wars for its independence. Just close the door. You're good. Okay. So Finland would end up fighting two wars in the Second Winter War, which, or the First Winter War, which the Russians would invade in the winter in Finland. Finland is one of the coldest countries in Europe, so Siberian weather, and they would invade in winter. The Russians would get absolutely tossed, losing 4-1 against the Finnish people, while the Russians had tanks, planes, developed mobile arms, and the Finnish had bolt action hunters rifles.
I get it though. Winter sucks,
Yeah,
especially like up there. It is brutal.
they didn't even like majorly lose people to attrition. They were just getting way outmaneuvered because it was a Finnish winter and the Finnish people had been way accustomed to that. I mean, can you
Yeah.
imagine if you were recruited in Moscow? You think, oh yeah, I can handle the winter. I've been living in it's like living in Chicago and then moving to like none of it in Canada.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like
it's like a different level.
you think you're used to winter, different winter. It's
Yeah.
like -20 some days.
Yeah,
Like
and
it's
their
bad.
clothes suck too.
Yeah.
Like they didn't have good shit back then. It was
Yeah.
like whatever,
It
stuff that
was
would
like you'd get a jacket, a little trench coat, call it a day.
yeah, it's just wild. Do you think like
Yeah.
I don't know if there's like many time periods that would suck more than being like a soldier in that environment where like you're at war, you're probably gonna die and it's just like impossibly cold with like no real protection. It's gotta be
Mhm.
like bottom of the barrel human life experience,
Yeah. A lot of them don't have gloves.
which is insane. My
Yeah.
Radon's fingers could never.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What they would do is they would advance with tanks commonly, but for the Russians and the Germans. And so you'd have these big convoys of people just like beelining to cities. And so the Finnish were like, what? Because you'd have a completely oblivious line of people, tanks, trucks just going down the road. And if you have an entire line set up in the fields, in the snow, in the marshes, if you have people actually like submerged in the snow that are impossible to see at a distance, it'd be very easy to take out all of that stuff and then use it against them, which they did. And so anything they didn't destroy, they would take back immediately. And it was a very popular war for the Finnish. It was a very patriotic war, which
Yeah.
means it's a lot of recruitment, a lot of people coming in for a country with like 1 million people total.
Oh yeah, dude. That's like the ultimate war. Like everyone's behind defending their homeland.
Hmm.
So it's like everybody's on board 100%.
The Russians were not. They were not ready for that Finnish winter.
Mm-hmm.
And so this absolute defeat, they actually did end up winning because the Finnish did end up giving up the land they wanted, but it was at such a toll between losing, 10-1 tanks, losing, tons of guns, people, like all of this stuff. They were done. They took back the little tiny strip of land they wanted, and it was a gross victory. So Germany looked at that and said, well, this guy with no planes, no tanks, no developed mobile arms, nothing, basically, was able to absolutely manhandle Russia. I can manhandle Russia. That's why the quote of Russia is a rotting house waiting for the door to be kicked in.
Okay.
That's why. It was following that victory from the Russians. So you have the Operation Barbarossa, where the Russians mobilized 90% of their troops to just push into into Russia. It was something like 3 million people
Damn.
advancing into Russia. The population of some small European countries was moving into Russia. Russia at this time had like I think 130 million people. Germany had half of that.
Hmm.
So you have all of these people marching to Russia who had not very well developed lines. They didn't have a good air force. The first air battle in Russia, which is like the most major one with the most deployed Russian forces, they lost something like 5,000 planes and the Germans lost like 50. It was
Jesus.
it was a slaughter. It was an absolute slaughter. The
5,000 planes. I can't even imagine. Can you imagine even stuff you don't think about where like 5,000 planes get destroyed? Like just there's wreckage everywhere. Like if you're in Russia, like there's just wreckage everywhere, planes and like all
Well,
kinds of stuff.
what they did is because it was so fast, they were just bombing them in their hangars. They didn't even have the
Yeah,
chance to get up in the air because they didn't have the infrastructure to be like, hey, guess what? We're at war. We need you up in the air. But they found that out when they actually saw the planes bombing them.
that's
So they had no
wild.
time to get in the air.
Dude, you think about the money too, like all the money spent on production for 5,000 planes, and they
Mhm.
just get wiped with like no return on investment, essentially.
Mhm.
Like economically too. I don't know how much planes
Yeah.
cost back then to make, but it had to be an insane amount.
It was largely licensed production models of World War One planes. So they weren't like, obviously they're still expensive,
Yeah.
but they weren't using expensive materials. So they were cloth, wood, the most expensive piece in them was the engine to machine gun.
They just have motorized toothpicks flying
They
around.
were completely inferior.
Yeah.
And like obviously the Russians would improve from those, but it was like their Air Force was not prepared. It was not ready. And
Yeah.
so you have complete destruction on ground, air, and to a degree naval. There wasn't a large naval conflict between Russia and Germany, but Germany essentially blockaded them in the North Sea from being able to get supplies. And so you have somewhat of a fight there, but it's not a major conflict.
Yeah. So they pretty much just run roughshod over
Mhm.
Russia pretty easily.
Pretty
Well, and then they
easily.
have Russia, and it's like, what does that give them?
So they have two major goals. One is Hitler's goal, which is complete destruction of Russia. He
Yeah.
does not like them. He thinks they're a corrupt socialist, blah blah blah,
Which is
whatever.
hilarious, like a holier than thou like argument from Hitler. He's like, these guys, they suck, really. It's hilarious.
It's funny he hated socialism so much because he was representing the National Socialist Party.
Kind of funny, kind of ironic.
Yep. So you have complete destruction of Russia. You have, oh, the second reason, my bad, oil in the Caucasus.
Okay.
Caucasus are one of the biggest producers of oil in the world, and they're the biggest in Russia. So you have enough oil in these fields to fuel Germany continuously
Hmm. Yeah, that does
to
make sense.
infinitum. Like this would be able to fuel their war economy for a very, very, very long time. Just these oil fields.
So in a sense, I mean, Hitler's still like just building the foundation for what he wants to do.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And so he pushes them up to the gates of Moscow and Stalingrad, two major cities. These are, you know, the biggest, most extreme land gains for any country, like since Alexander the Great, for that amount of time. Like wild.
Yeah.
And so you have taking over of vast swaths of Russia. You have building of, at this point now, concentration camps are becoming a major thing. There's more and more getting built. You have, I think by the end of the war, there were hundreds of them scattered over mostly occupied territory. And I mean, you had Einsatzgruppen, which was mobile death vans.
Wow. Okay.
Not great.
Yeah.
So this point is like Hitler's second major blunder, second major issue, and that is, well, Stalingrad and its namesake, Stalin, are kind of a major deal. So being able to take Stalingrad would be a major FU to Stalin. It would it would not be good. And so it's put on pretty much equal priority to Moscow itself. Hitler decided it would be better to put furthered efforts on Stalingrad. And so what you have is, have you ever seen the movie based on this?
Maybe
Stalingrad.
once upon a time, probably been a hot second.
All right. There's a couple famous things from that movie, like every person gets a gun and the next person or one person gets a gun, one person gets ammo. You run in and you find a gun and you put the ammo in the gun. Like that's a famous thing, but it's not exactly true. They had very major supplies shortages to Stalingrad, not Stalin. So you have first stage of taking over Stalingrad, of moving all your troops there, and then bombing it to pieces, just completely destroying the city, turning it to rubble. That was arguably a mistake, depending on how you look at it, what you think of it, because it means that tanks can no longer be moved in. And what are you going to do to a tank if you have a bolt action rifle? And so, you know, you wouldn't want your tank in an exposed position like that, surrounded by people that don't want it there. But at the same time, it's armor, and they didn't have armor in the Battle of Stalingrad, essentially. So all these forces being pushed here, like a million people, like so many people being here, trying to take this one city. And they have it surrounded and they're pushing through and they're pushing through. At this point, they're on the second year of their conflict and it's moving into winter of their second year. They're worn down, they're tired. After their first year, of their first winter, they were not thinking would be that bad. Their first winter was not that bad. This winter was that bad. They were no longer in the calm, cool, Polish winters. They weren't in like the southwestern Russia where it's not as bad. They were in Moscow. They were in Stalingrad. They were in very, very cold winter places without any real winter clothes. The logistics problem is also getting very bad at this point. Germany is good at logistics. They were good at logistics all through this war up until this point because now they have heavy tanks that their normal guns can't kill.
Yeah,
Think of the KV-1S, KV-1E. These are heavy tanks with up to 120 millimeters of armor. Stuff that is a struggle for these early German 50 millimeter guns. So they need new tanks, new guns. They need clothes for their people. They need better guns. They need new everything, essentially, coming into 1942, 1941. Like these,
yeah.
they need more stuff. They need better stuff. And what they're not picking up from, you know, these Russians, these French, these Austrians is better anything. A lot of it is worse than what they already had. So they have to keep developing new things. And then at the same time, the other Western powers are developing new, better stuff. Think of the British radar system, something that the Germans did not account for at all. So Stalingrad is a slaughter. They eventually are completely encircled by Georgy Zhukov and his massive pincer movement. He cuts them off, ends up being about 300,000 or 400,000 Germans taken hostage or killed.
That's wild.
Yep. So their entire army group gone. Stalingrad, the siege is lifted, and genuinely, if the siege had gone on into spring, they would have lost Stalingrad. They were already on the last sector of the city when Georgy Zhukov was able to come back. So things are not great. Things are not the best. Um, Germany is at this point, they've lost a major group. now they've lost their entire southern front is now having a major movement against it, and so they're having their entire army fall back so that they don't get encircled. And then it just continues on until they're on the gates of Berlin, essentially. Normandy happens, the French, American, British, Polish, Belgian, tons and tons of different people and groups of people land on the beaches and push up into France. France at this point was not greatly defended. It was defended. There were people there, but they were not positioned in such a way to be able to react quickly. And because of the Panzer Group being under direct order by Hitler, since it happened while Hitler was asleep, there was 6 hours of invasion before the panzers could be mobilized, and at that point, their effect would be virtually null. So dictators, I mean, yikes.
Yeah. So I mean, they get kind of screwed there.
Yeah.
Um, and so they're closing in, kind of like
hmm
pushing, and then like what happens next at that point?
Once everyone's landed in and they're pushing in on Germany, it is a mad dash to Berlin. The Russians want control of Berlin so they can have absolute control over all of Eastern Europe, which is a goal for them. Controlling all of Europe, having a Warsaw bloc where they can, you know, really spread their influence. And, Britain, America, France wanting to push into Berlin first so that they can have a free democratic West under their control. Really, at the core of it, the idea is the same. We want control. It's just the expression of that control is different. Communism is a little bit worse.
A little bit, a little
A little
bit.
bit. A little bit.
So who gets to Berlin first?
It is the British American forces. They actually get to Berlin first, but the siege of Berlin had been started by the by the Russians. So they're essentially there at the same time. So you have, Russian forces on the edge of Berlin. You have American French forces actually in Berlin, and now they have to divvy it up. So what you end up with is half of Berlin being controlled by the Russians. And at this point, the other half is not controlled by, America or the West. It's actually divvied up between them. France gets a little, Britain gets a little, America gets a little. Italy, I haven't really talked about them, but basically they kind of ate spaghetti and no, I'm just
As they do,
kidding. No,
obviously.
they kind of they started a war with Greece and Yugoslavia, and they really tried to push in North Africa, but they did nothing and ended up just drawing more resources from Germany, who had to fix all of their wars and problems for them, which did not help them when they actually started Barbarossa, which is good for us. And Italy ended up switching to the side of the Americans after they were invaded as a part of Operation Torch, I
Those
think.
quitters.
Those quitters, they quit on Germany every war.
Jumping on the bandwagon just because things got difficult.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And part of that was because Mussolini was getting very unpopular with all of his terrible wars, and also Italy was never really with him totally 100% to begin with.
Yeah. It's
They
like
were
if
like,
you're gonna be at
"Okay."
war all the time as a country, like you better be at least good at it,
Oh
you
yeah.
know?
Oh yeah. If you're gonna be nationalist, if you're gonna be so extreme, you better be good at it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, he was the first and the worst fascist in Europe,
Yeah.
and
Loudly
Lenin
proud.
was the first and arguably the best
Hmm.
communist in Europe, communist
And
leader.
it's like the whole kind of Berlin thing happened. You have, Italy kind of did its thing. What's like how does it keep progressing?
It's Italy falls apart. They try to invade from the south and get absolutely tossed by the Germans and end up actually destroying a couple historic Italian monuments, which is partly why Italy has a small amount of beef with America now because they trash their country.
Hmm. A small amount of spaghetti with us,
Yeah,
I might say.
but then we gave them a ton of money after the war, so
Fixes everything.
fixes everything.
Yeah.
Same thing with Greece. That's how we got them to stop doing communism. We gave them a lot of money.
All right, cool.
Gave them money and industry and business. And they were much more on board with that than commie over here.
Yeah. I mean,
So
yeah.
flipping communists.
I mean, listen, if you give me enough money, I'll consider making life shifts for sure.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
enough give you enough money and food that you never have to work again. You'll switch over to communism.
I don't know what that would look like for me, but I'm open to the idea.
Hold on one sec.
Cool. We back.
I actually have to go.
Cool, cool.
So
Well,
pick
that
this
actually
up
kind of
again
works out too, because I was thinking we definitely have like more stuff to cover. I think a part two would be cool.
for sure.
Cool, cool. I feel like we hit a good stopping point too, so this kind
Yeah.
of works out.
Yeah.
Well,
All right.
thank you for doing this. I
Thank you.
will probably get it up sometime in the next week after I get it all like edited together.
All right.
But I'll shoot you a link when I do.
Cool. I'll see you around.
Cool, cool. Peace.